The crash site was unstable. The rescue teams backed away. The human stepped forward and started pulling. Heat shimmered in the air above the wreck, blurring its jagged edges into a hallucination of form and shadow. The transport vessel had come in low and fast, trying to make a controlled descent after losing both primary engines. It had clipped a ridge before the valley floor, gouging metal and flesh into the dirt like a half-finished burial. Debris was scattered for hundreds of meters, some chunks glowing faintly with residual heat, others already cooling to the dull sheen of scrap. Alien medics and engineers stood at the perimeter, their suits flashing diagnostic overlays in a language only their own teams could read. Structural sensors had been embedded in the largest debris pieces, but they all told the same story: critical instability, high collapse risk, zero safe entry points. They marked the site with floating perimeter beacons and called in for heavy equipment. No one approached the wreck. Not until the secondary response team arrived. Not until Daniel Price stepped out of the transport. He wore a utility vest over a simple thermal shirt, his sleeves rolled up halfway up his forearms. His gloves were already off. There was a scar along his left wrist that caught the light for a moment as he walked straight past the waiting rescue personnel, eyes scanning the wreckage, not in fear, but with the slow precision of someone building a mental map. A tall Thalaxi technician moved to intercept him. Her species had 6 eyes and a flexible jaw that folded vertically when she spoke. "You must wait for equipment. Readings indicate full collapse risk." Daniel paused. "I know." She blinked in confusion. "Then you will wait?" "No," he said simply, and stepped around her. A ripple passed through the alien crews. Commands were issued in low tones. The perimeter extended by another 10 meters. Structural stress readings continued to spike. Some medics retreated to a secondary station, already assuming there would be injuries, and not just from the survivors under the wreckage. Daniel stood at the edge of the largest chunk of hull. The plating was twisted into a shape no diagram could have predicted. Its edges curled inward as if trying to swallow itself. He reached out and placed his bare hand against the metal. The surface was hot, but not scalding. More importantly, it vibrated. Not a tremble of instability, but the deep harmonic hum of tension waiting to be released. "Manual readings confirmed," he muttered to himself. "Load paths aren't random. It's still distributing stress." Another alien approached this one, a short, tri-limbed medic, whose translator buzzed softly as he spoke. "Sir, movement may cause additional collapse. Survivors are not yet reachable. The risk to organics is—" Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the apex of a bent support spar, one that had been part of the vessel's midline corridor. He crouched, tracking the way fractured beams had interlocked. They'd created a precarious balance, deadly if disturbed, but predictable if you knew what to look for. "Sir," the medic said again, louder this time. Daniel looked up. "You said the survivors aren't reachable. That's true, but they're alive." The medic hesitated. "Their life signs are faint." "Then we don't wait," Daniel said, and moved forward again. Metal protested under his weight. Sensors shrieked warnings. Alien voices shouted behind him, calling for him to stop, to fall back, to let machines do what flesh shouldn't. But he was already under the overhang, kneeling beside a split section of frame. One by one, he examined the joining points. His fingers traced fracture lines, cataloged shear angles, and measured shifts in compression with nothing more than practiced touch. He reached for the first beam, braced himself, and pulled. The groan was immense, a chorus of tortured metal that echoed off the valley walls. The hull shifted, not a collapse, but a rebalancing. Dust erupted from the joints as internal supports shifted under the new weight distribution. Structural sensors exploded in a chorus of red warnings, and the closest alien team members turned and sprinted back to the safety perimeter. Daniel didn't move. He planted his feet wider and pulled again. Another beam came loose, folding outward like a page being turned. A section of paneling clattered free behind it, skittering down a slope of crumpled alloy. The noise faded quickly, swallowed by the silence that followed. Only the wind and the soft hiss of cooling metal remained. One of the medics, the same short one from before, peeked around a debris ridge, his translator flickering nervously. "Are you injured?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Not yet." He adjusted his stance, then placed both palms on the next obstruction. This one was trickier, a crossbeam loaded at both ends, pinning a support strut beneath it. He rocked it slightly, testing its resistance, then shifted the angle. It slid just enough to let him wedge his shoulder under it. "Wait!" a voice called behind him. Daniel ignored it. He pushed upward, carefully, shifting the beam's angle to offload pressure onto an adjacent support. The metal hissed in protest, then stilled. A long breath later, the beam dropped behind him with a loud thunk, landing in a spot that wouldn't cause secondary collapse. Something deep inside the wreck gave way, but not near him. A chunk of hull collapsed inward on the opposite side of the debris field, sending up a plume of smoke and dust. Alien rescue teams panicked, retreating even further. It looked catastrophic from the outside. But Daniel turned toward the sound, smiled faintly, and went back to work. That collapse had relieved a pressure pocket one he'd been counting on. His hands were scraped now, knuckles darkened with bruises and dirt. He worked with methodical care, never rushing, always recalculating after each shift. The structure groaned, shifted, threatened, but it held. He didn't try to overpower it, he listened to it. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the wreck. Alien crews had long since stopped shouting. They watched from afar, some in silence, some recording. The perimeter markers blinked helplessly, useless, against the human who had ignored them. Finally, Daniel stepped back and wiped his forehead. A corridor, narrow but stable, cut through the wreckage, leading to a partially intact section of the transport's inner hull. Inside, faint life signs flickered on the medic's remote sensors. One of the alien team leads activated his communicator. "Stabilization achieved," he said, sounding unsure. "Human-created access route is viable." Daniel stretched his shoulders, rotating one with a wince. "Structure's not safe," he said without turning around. "But it won't collapse. Not unless someone panics." The rescue teams hesitated, then began to advance. Slowly, cautiously. Some of them kept their eyes on the wreckage. Others kept their eyes on Daniel. Medics passed him as they entered the corridor. No one said anything. No one had to. Inside, survivors were pulled from tangled seats and collapsed compartments. 4 conscious, 2 unconscious, all injured but alive. Med scans showed trauma, burns, lacerations, no fatalities. Daniel finally stepped aside, flexing his fingers, bloodied but still functional. One of the engineers nearby was replaying drone footage, looping the moment Daniel adjusted just seconds before each stress spike. Every collapse had gone away from him. "You predicted it," the engineer muttered. "Every shift, every break point." Daniel didn't respond. He walked past the stunned crews, heading toward the supply transport at the edge of the valley. As he passed the medic from earlier, the tri-limbed one, he nodded once. "Site's yours again," he said. "Try not to mess it up." The medic opened his mouth, then closed it. Behind them, the transport wreck was reclassified by the local command net. New designation, Human-Managed Stabilization. Daniel Price sat on the edge of a storage crate, shaking out his sore hands, and finally allowed himself a breath that didn't taste like smoke. Daniel awoke with a sharp throb in his right shoulder and a cramp running down the side of his neck. He'd fallen asleep against a storage crate, back leaned into the metal, head cocked at an angle his body didn't appreciate. He blinked the haze from his eyes and sat up slowly, flexing sore muscles as the sun rose behind the mountains, painting the valley in a harsh orange glare. A temporary medical station had been assembled overnight. It stood just beyond the wreckage, a patchwork of collapsible walls, sterile domes, and sensor towers still chiming softly as they recalibrated. Alien medics bustled around inside, their movements quick and precise. The survivors had all made it through the night barely. 3 were still unconscious, 2 on assisted respiration, but stable. The local field commander, a Cernathi with a too long neck and flickering necklight, had issued a formal commendation for Daniel's actions. He hadn't read it. He didn't need to. What mattered was that the survivors were alive. Daniel rolled his shoulder again and stood up. The soreness in his arms had settled into a familiar ache, the kind he knew how to live with. It reminded him of long hours on orbital construction rigs, lifting bulk plates with nothing but a winch and good judgment. Machines made things efficient, but they didn't understand structure. They didn't feel stress before it became failure. His name was already spreading. Rescue personnel from another region had arrived during the night shift. They didn't approach him, but he saw the way they glanced over, like he was something fragile and dangerous at the same time. He was used to that reaction. Humans tended to inspire uncertainty in places where logic governed everything, especially when someone like him broke all the rules and walked away with the results to show for it. A familiar voice called out behind him, "You're supposed to be in medbay." He turned. The Thalaxi technician from the day before stood a few meters away, holding a scanning tablet. Her 4 upper eyes were narrowed in what passed for a glare. The 2 lower ones flicked between his hands and shoulders. "I slept," he replied. "That counts." "No, it doesn't. You refused a full diagnostic. That shoulder is inflamed. The minor lacerations on your hands are showing delayed coagulation, likely from residual heat exposure." "I washed them," Daniel said, lifting one palm. "See? Mostly clean." She stepped forward anyway and ran the scanner across his forearm. The tablet chimed angrily. She sighed. "Do all humans refuse basic care out of pride, or is it just you?" "Habit," he said. "I grew up in Luna construction bays. You learn not to waste med resources unless something's broken." She folded her lower arms across her chest. "You're not in a construction bay anymore. You're in a multi-species rescue zone under Joint Command jurisdiction." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that a threat or a reminder?" "Both," she said dryly, then paused. "Still, I reviewed the telemetry. Your load path predictions were accurate, very accurate. I got lucky." "No," she said. "You were methodical. You used tactile input and structural resonance to map stress distribution in real time. That's not luck. That's disturbing." "Thank you," he said, not entirely sure it was a compliment. The Thalaxi hesitated, then extended her lower hand. "My name is Irisha. I've been doing structural analysis for 11 cycles. I've never seen a creature act like a living stabilizer node." Daniel shook her hand. Her grip was firmer than expected. "Daniel Price, Earthborn. I mostly build things. Sometimes I dig through the wreckage of them." Another chime echoed across the camp, this time from the perimeter sensors. The central display near the medical station lit up with new signals. Daniel turned, reading the unfamiliar glyphs. Irisha tapped her comm and hissed something in Thalaxi dialect. "New crash?" Daniel asked. "No," she said. "Recovery detail. A demolition team. They're here to clear the unstable sections. Final sweep." He frowned. "They don't need to demolish it anymore. We've got survivors out. The site's not in immediate danger." "They don't see it that way," she said. "Protocols state—" "Screw the protocols," Daniel snapped. "There are still valid internal structures. If they collapse that wreck, you won't get a single data node or structural black box intact. And if the rear section folds into that ravine—" "I know," Irisha said, holding up a hand. "Believe me, I know. But they didn't send a discussion team. They sent automated rigs." Sure enough, the heavy lift transports that arrived a moment later were cradling demolition drones the size of trucks, each one armed with plasma torches and seismic disruptors. They didn't wait for clearance. They began descending toward the crash zone the moment their landing struts hit the dirt. Daniel watched them, jaw tight. That entire site's been pressure stabilized by redistribution. If they start cutting blindly, you'll be buried, Irisha finished grimly. "I'll stop them." "Daniel, they don't care." He was already walking. The first drone reached the wreck's southern quadrant, igniting its plasma torch with a rising hum. Sparks flew as the beam carved into the exterior plating. Almost instantly, nearby support struts began to creak. The pressure balance shifted. Daniel didn't shout. Shouting at machines never worked. Instead, he sprinted. The ground beneath him shook as the drone activated its disruptor, a low-frequency pulse designed to break buried infrastructure. The vibration rolled through the wreckage like thunder. Panels shuddered. An entire wall shifted downward by half a meter, dragging a secondary support beam with it. Daniel reached the drone just as it fired a second pulse. He threw himself up onto its chassis and yanked open the maintenance panel. It wasn't built for human fingers, but he'd dismantled worse. A moment later, he ripped out the power conduit and severed the command loop. The drone hissed and slumped, inert. Behind him, alarms erupted. 2 more drones changed course, identifying Daniel as a live obstruction. He jumped down and waved his arms. "Get your machines off my site!" No response. The drones didn't recognize his authority. They weren't programmed to. Then Irisha's voice came through his comm. "Stall them. I'm rerouting the authorization grid." "How long do I have?" "Not long." The The systems double-locked. The next drone surged forward, pivoting its cutting arm toward the wreckage. Daniel moved in again, ducking under its arm and jamming a crowbar into the joint pivot. It wasn't enough to stop the cut, but it slowed the arm's motion. The drone recalibrated too slowly. Daniel grabbed a stabilizer clamp from his belt and latched it onto the drone's leg, freezing the lower actuator. The drone stumbled and collapsed sideways. "You're going to get crushed," Irisha's voice warned. "One misstep already took worse yesterday," he muttered. The last drone was smarter. It activated a proximity deterrent field, designed to repel organic interference. Daniel gritted his teeth and walked straight into it. The pulse hit his chest like a wall of heat, driving the air from his lungs. But he kept walking. He reached the core panel and slammed it open. Behind him, the crash site groaned. That was all he needed to hear. Daniel yanked free the master link and shut the drone down seconds before it could fire another disruptor pulse. Silence returned. The wreck stilled. Irisha's voice came through, breathless. Grid rerouted. Override complete. Demolition halted. Daniel dropped to his knees, panting. A long moment passed before the camp reacted. Several alien engineers ran toward the disabled drones. A Cernathi officer shouted orders to shut down local command protocols. Someone else ran a new diagnostic on the wreck site. Daniel sat back and let the adrenaline wear off. His fingers were shaking, his arms burned, but the structure held. Later, in the command tent, Irisha pulled up a schematic of the wreck and overlaid Daniel's manual intervention points. Each one correlated with stress redirection that had kept the main hull from collapsing. "You're not a builder," she said, watching the data light his work in glowing arcs. "You're a structure empath." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that a real title?" "No, but it should be." A younger alien engineer leaned over the table. "We've never seen anything like this. You felt the failure points before they tripped. That's not just analysis, that's instinct." "It's work," Daniel said. "Just a different kind." The room went quiet. From that point forward, no drones were allowed near the wreckage. All further recovery efforts were conducted under Daniel's supervision, not because he demanded it, but because every attempt to replace his judgment ended in close calls or system errors. By nightfall, the site was formally reclassified. The demolition order rescinded. Daniel walked the outer rim of the wreck alone, headlamp casting long shadows through the debris. He paused by a cracked display screen, half buried in dirt. Inside it, someone had written a name in grease pencil, one of the survivors. A small human touch in a sea of shattered steel. He smiled faintly. Nothing about this had gone according to the manual, but it had gone right. The rain started after midnight. Not a storm, but a steady, sullen drizzle that turned the valley into a shallow bog. Water collected in the gaps between shattered hull plating, pooled in broken compartments, and soaked the temporary walkways strung between sections of the wreck. By morning, the site looked like it had aged a decade, overnight darker, quieter, heavier. Daniel stood near the main corridor he'd cleared days earlier, now reinforced with collapsible scaffolding and segmented shields. It was safer, yes, but it also felt wrong, not dangerous tamed. Engineered into predictability by teams who didn't really understand what had made it hold together in the first place. He watched one of the alien engineers affix a structural stabilizer node to a beam he had manually repositioned. The node blinked green. The engineer made a satisfied sound and moved on. Daniel remained behind, eyeing the beam. Something in the distribution didn't sit right. "Hey," he called out, motioning the engineer back. "You're off center. That beam's absorbing secondary load from the dorsal side." The engineer tilted its head. "We recalculated based on the new baseline." "You recalculated wrong," Daniel said, stepping forward and tapping the edge of the beam. "The flex pattern here, see the rusting line? That's tension creep. You're putting the node on a spot that looks stable, but it's already fatigued." The engineer hesitated. "We scanned it. Nothing flagged." Daniel reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small chisel and magnet. He set them against the beam. The magnet slid slowly, then suddenly jerked to one side. Daniel nodded. "There. Stress vectors shifted. Move your stabilizer 2 centimeters east, or it's a false fix." The engineer did as instructed, and a moment later, the stabilizer blinked yellow, then locked green again, this time with a quieter hum. Daniel stepped back. "That'll hold." The engineer blinked several lenses at him. We have sensors capable of reading substructural harmonics across molecular frequencies. How did you see that? Daniel shrugged. I didn't see it. I heard it yesterday when that strut gave way downfield, changed the way the load flexes here. Your models didn't update for that. He walked away without waiting for a reply. He wasn't being rude, he was just tired. And not from the work. From the skepticism. Every fix he made had to be proven twice, once by doing it, and again by defending why it had worked. The alien crews didn't mean harm. They were smart, trained, methodical, but none of their training accounted for someone like him. A stabilizer without a harness. A human whose hands replaced a full diagnostic suite. At the edge of the wreck, he found Irisha under a portable canopy, working through sensor logs. She barely looked up as he approached. New adjustments? He nodded. Beam. 12C was torquing wrong. It's fine now. She tapped her console. We're seeing a 25% drop in tension variance over the last cycle. Not bad. He sat down on the edge of a case beside her. They still think I'm guessing. Irisha exhaled through her mandibles, a gesture Daniel had learned meant resignation, not irritation. They're used to data, not intuition. The mated in Minas of Yua. It's not intuition, it's experience. Which, they've never seen, applied this way. Daniel tilted his head back and watched the clouds churn above. The drizzle had eased, but mist clung to the ridges. You'd think they'd trust results. Oh, they do, she said, quietly, reluctantly, with caveats. He let that hang in the air. Then he asked, how many survivors did we get out total? 6, she said. 4 are stable. 2 are still in isolation biocontainment precautions, but all alive. Daniel nodded. Then it worked. Irisha looked at him. You understand you're the outlier, right? Most humans wouldn't do what you did. He glanced sideways. Most people wouldn't need to. No, she said. Most people would have waited for permission. There was movement down the slope. A group of unfamiliar figures were approaching 2 tall, sleek officials in dark uniforms, flanked by a pair of drone escorts. The officials weren't dressed like engineers or rescue crew. Daniel recognized the posture before anything else. Oversight, bureaucracy, problem identifiers looking for something to regulate. I know that look, he muttered. Somebody made a report. Irisha closed her console. You made waves. Some of them want to crash back. The taller of the 2 officials, a pale-skinned Lithari with a glossy crest and narrow pupil-less eyes, stepped forward with slow deliberation. Daniel Price? Depends who's asking. I am Commander Severix, Field Operations Oversight, High Rescue Authority. I've been reviewing incident logs from this site. Good bedtime reading. Severix didn't react. Your actions during the stabilization of Crash Site Theta-7 exceeded operational parameters and violated standing protocol on hazard engagement. Several of your methods lack formal certification or predictive modeling support. Daniel stood slowly. And? Severix's tone didn't change. You're not trained in the use of extraterritorial rescue analytics. You acted against sensor guidance. You disabled high-value drones and restructured debris paths without formal authorization, all of which pose risk to both survivors and personnel. And the survivors lived, Daniel said flatly. That is not the point. Yes, it is, Daniel said, stepping closer. That's the only point. Severix shifted, not in alarm, but in calculation. You present a liability in standardized operations. Your methodology cannot be replicated or modeled. You are not a system we cannot depend on your presence for future incidents. Therefore, we must consider whether your inclusion in response teams is sustainable. Irisha stood too. Without him, this site would have collapsed on itself before the first drone arrived. Severix's gaze didn't move. That may be true, but it does not set a precedent we can manage. Human intuition is not a reliable protocol. Daniel shook his head. You want me to follow rules that would have gotten people killed. I want you to operate within the frameworks that preserve safety for everyone, including yourself. He took a slow breath. I'm not a machine. I don't have a framework. I have hands and experience. You can't certify instinct. Severix seemed almost disappointed. Then you leave us no choice. Formal restriction protocols will be submitted. Your access to high-risk sites will be revoked pending review. Irisha stepped forward. He's not even under your jurisdiction. He is now, Severix said. Provisional oversight was transferred 2 cycles ago. This site is officially classified as an interspecies incident. Human assets fall under shared command. Daniel folded his arms. So, that's it. Paper says I shouldn't have saved them, so you'll make sure I can't next time. Severix didn't answer. He turned and walked away. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone near the ridge above the crash site. The rain had returned, light and steady. His hands ached again, not from injury, but from pressure, resisting the urge to punch something he couldn't touch. Irisha found him there, holding a flask of warmed nutrient broth in one hand and her tablet in the other. I filed a dispute, she said, sitting beside him. It won't change the decision, but it'll get reviewed. Daniel nodded. You don't have to fight this. Yes, I do, she said. Because if they start punishing results that don't fit their models, the next disaster kills more people. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Irisha asked, What'll you do? He shrugged. Dunno. Maybe go back to building things. Less red tape when you're putting up habitat domes. More bolts, fewer egos. I heard someone's already started calling you the stabilizer, Daniel snorted. Sounds like a piece of gym equipment. Still, she said, it fits. Far below, rescue teams were finishing their final pass through the wreck. Floodlights lit the valley in beams of clean white. The corridors Daniel had cleared were still standing. The survivors he'd reached were still alive. The data he'd left behind, unorthodox though it was now being cited in at least 3 structural journals. And somewhere in those files, in small footnotes and appendices, his name appeared next to the phrase, Manual stabilization performed successfully under high-risk conditions without mechanical assistance. That night, when Daniel finally slept, his hands still ached. But not from injury, from use. And it was the best kind of pain he knew. Morning brought the low thrum of engines, nothing loud, nothing fast. A long, rectangular vessel drifted overhead, its underslung modules gleaming dull silver in the early sun. It was a mobile review platform, a floating courthouse by any other name, and it hovered now with slow, deliberate menace above the wreck site. Its presence wasn't necessary for rescue. It wasn't there to save lives. It had come to make decisions. Daniel Price didn't look up. He was kneeling at the base of a shattered bulkhead, running his fingers along a torn seam in the metal. The section had twisted under heat and impact, then locked into itself like folded foil. It had held, surprisingly, creating a crawl space that had shielded one of the unconscious survivors from the worst of the collapse. If it had failed just a little differently, the woman inside would have been crushed. He didn't know her name. He hadn't needed to. Saving her hadn't required it. Behind him, footsteps crunched softly on gravel and mud. Irisha approached, holding a data slate close to her chest. They've asked for you, she said. They're calling it a proceedings review, not a trial. Daniel stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Feels like a trial. They brought an arbiter. Definitely a trial. She hesitated, then extended the slate. They asked for a formal statement. From you. You can record it. Or I can deliver it. Daniel took the slate but didn't immediately speak. He stared at the wreck again. At what was left of it. Then he said, I'll do it. The review chamber had been constructed just off the ridge. It was temporary, like everything here, but designed for formality. Clean walls. Single entry point. One long table, facing a semicircle of alien officials, seated behind a transparent screen that shimmered faintly with privacy protocols. Daniel stood at the center, flanked by no counsel, no escort, and no backup. Irisha was in the second row, arms crossed, antennae laid flat against her skull, a gesture of protest in her species. Across from him sat Commander Severix, and beside him, an arbiter, a tall, elderly figure of unknown species, wrapped in a simple robe, with thin translucent membranes where ears might have been. The arbiter's voice, when it came, was soft but deeply resonant. You may speak freely, Daniel Price. He nodded once. I've read the reports, Daniel began, so I won't waste your time denying anything. Yes, I entered the wreckage against protocol. Yes, I moved debris manually without clearance. I disabled demolition drones. I restructured the site with no oversight. That's all true. The chamber was quiet. Severix leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for the catch. But it's also true, Daniel continued, that every action I took was measured, informed, experienced. the kind of experience that doesn't fit neatly into a certification line or a simulation. He took a step forward, voice steady. I've spent my entire adult life inside structures building them, repairing them, saving people from the worst parts of them. When I walk into a collapsed frame, I'm not guessing. I'm reading it. Like a second language, steel talks when it's under pressure. Tension sings. You just have to know how to listen. A faint shift in the chamber. One of the officials glanced toward the arbiter, but the old figure remained still. I understand that what I did was risky, Daniel said, but not reckless. I don't take pride in ignoring protocol. I take responsibility for lives. And on that day, hesitation would have been lethal. No machine could have done what I did. The site was bleeding time, so I used what I had: my hands, my back, my judgment. He raised the slate Irisha had given him. This, I could fill it with diagrams, calculations, theory, but none of that would explain what really mattered. I knew where to put pressure. I knew where not to pull, because I've failed before. I've lost people before, and I've carried that weight into every site since. He lowered the slate. I won't apologize for saving lives the only way I could. Silence. Then the arbiter lifted one long finger, gesturing toward Severix. You maintain that human intuition is a liability, the arbiter said, voice low and even. That reliance on unpredictable behavior undermines protocol. I do, Severix replied, calm but firm. Standardization exists for a reason. If one outlier succeeds, it encourages deviation. The next outlier may not survive, or worse, may endanger others. The arbiter turned to Daniel. How would you respond to that? Daniel looked around the room, at the shimmering screens, at the officials, at Irisha's quiet, unmoving stance in the second row. Then he answered, I never asked anyone else to follow me in. I didn't order the medics to stay close. I told them to stay out. This wasn't some show of bravery. I walked in alone because I knew I could, because I've done it before. If someone else tries to copy me without that experience, that's not on me. That's on whoever failed to teach them the difference between courage and stupidity. No anger, just honesty. The arbiter considered him for a long moment, then spoke again. I have reviewed the footage. Every movement you made was predictive, reactive in a way no algorithm accounted for. You treated the structure not as an object, but as a system. That is rare, and it is valuable. Severix opened his mouth, but the arbiter raised a hand. However, the arbiter said, the issue is not value, it is governance. If you remain unsupervised, others may feel empowered to bypass protocol under the guise of instinct. I don't need to be unsupervised, Daniel said. I just need to be trusted. That is a difficult thing to grant in a bureaucracy, the arbiter murmured. Then stood. Therefore, the arbiter continued, I offer a ruling. Daniel Price will retain his clearance, but going forward, he will be designated as a specialized structural consultant non-command, non-enforcement. He will be granted immediate access to high-risk sites with provisional authority, under direct observation. Daniel's eyes narrowed. So I'm trusted, but leashed. You are acknowledged, the arbiter said. Not elevated, not restrained. You are made visible, Mr. Price. That is more than most receive. Severix stiffened, but said nothing. The arbiter stepped down from the platform, passed within a meter of Daniel, and stopped. In every structure, the arbiter said quietly, there is a piece that doesn't fit the schematics. A crooked beam, a cracked weld, something that should have failed, but didn't. End quote. End quote. Daniel looked at them. You, human, are that piece. And then the arbiter was gone. They didn't celebrate. That wasn't Daniel's way, and it sure as hell wasn't Irisha's. But when the last of the officials left, and the review platform pulled away into the sky, she found him by the wreck again, still walking the edges, still looking for signs of new stress. You're cleared, she said. Mostly. He nodded. They're calling your designation the Price exception. He groaned. You're joking. I wish I were, but it's on the form. Category 7, Stabilization, subtagged as Price exception, human variant. Daniel leaned back against a support spar. I'm going to be in textbooks, aren't I? Probably the footnotes first. They stood there together for a while, just watching the wreckage fade into the day. In the end, the site was closed under the tag Human Managed Stabilization. The phrase began to circulate in engineering circles, mostly whispered, sometimes half-mocked, but never dismissed. Teams started asking for input from field-experienced humans, not just lab-trained analysts. And one by one, cases began to surface of humans who could sense collapse before it happened. Daniel never claimed to be the first, or the best. But he had been there when it mattered, with no suit, no scanner, no fallback, just hands and time and a stubborn refusal to watch people die because no one dared move. He left the site a week later, hitching a ride on a cargo shuttle headed for a terraforming array near the equatorial ridge. He didn't say goodbye to most of the crew, just gave Irisha a nod and a rare smile. "Try not to let anyone bolt stabilizers into load points without checking the welds," he said. "I'll try," she said. "But they don't listen like you." He shrugged. "They don't have to. Just watch for the seams." As the shuttle rose, Daniel looked down one last time at the wreckage. The valley was already starting to heal, mud drying, equipment packed, temporary scaffolds folded away. But the scars would remain. So would the corridor he'd cleared with his own bloodied hands. What holds, what breaks, it wasn't always about the metal. Sometimes it was about the people who walked into the failure before it happened, and knew exactly where to stand.